Hello, everybody. This is Greg Scorzo from Culture on the Offensive. Today I'm going to be talking to the writer and sociologist Nikos Sotirakopoulos about his fascinating and interesting book, which I'm sure a few of you have read, which is called Lifestyle Activism, From New Left to Occupy. And this book is a book that I couldn't put down reading as soon as I got a copy of it. I read it, I think, in a day and a half because it was so fascinating in the way that it completely explained a history of ideas that I wasn't really aware of before I read this book. So what I wanted to start off by asking you, Nikos, is what was the motivation for this book? What made you decide that this was the topic that you wanted to cover?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the kind words. So the book is, in a way, also, it coincides with a transition in my life, in my disillusionment with the left. So the book tries to trace back this shift that has happened in the left in the last 5 or 6 decades. In very simplistic terms, you can put it as the shift from the old left to the new left. And trying to understand, first of all, what were the characteristics of this shift, why this shift happened, and also try to prevent the usual accusation that would be that I'm creating a straw man. Therefore, I had to find a lot of case studies. I had to find a lot of examples in different areas, in different geographical regions, on different times, that would indicate that this change has indeed happened. So I started writing the book, or I started envisioning the book with an idea that the old left is good, the new left is not good, to put it in very simplistic, like caricature terms. As I wrote the book, I got over this very simplistic idea. Now I don't think that the old left was in any way as good as some romantics might think, but at least some of its philosophical messages, or at least the tradition it carried with more pride the tradition of the Enlightenment and the tradition of modernity. Whereas the new left has left this tradition aside. So this would be the overview of the book.
Okay, so let's start off going back to the beginning, really. So what is fundamentally the Enlightenment and modernity traditions that you see in the old left that you don't see in the new left?
So it's mostly, first of all, it's not the whole thing of the Enlightenment, because for me, the cornerstone of Enlightenment is reason and individualism. And the second part is not really there in big parts of the old left. But the thing that the old left takes for the Enlightenment tradition is this idea that if we use our minds, and if we use science, and if we dominate nature, and if we shape nature according to our will, then the future is going to be better and better. It's this idea that humans are agents of change. Now, quite often, the mistake is that the agent of change is seen as a group of people and not individuals, because I would say the agent of change are the individuals. The old left would see this as a group of people, which is, in my scale, it's a lower sin than saying that people are passive and subjects of history, which seems to be what has been happening in other parts of the left lately. So this is the relationship between old left and the Enlightenment. This idea that the use of our minds and reason and science and technology, the future can be better.
So if you think that was sort of the philosophical origins of the old left, what do you think are the politics of the old left? And how are those sort of distinct from the politics of the left today?
There were various different strands in the old left, but they had one thing in common, which was the idea of building a mass movement, that you get a critical mass of people, and in a way you impose change through political means. This would be a revolution, a dictatorship, parliamentary majority, reformism, but all these things, the thing that have in common is I engage a critical mass of people, I organize them politically, and I have a very specific plan. I will do this, this, and this. For example, again, as I said elsewhere, it would make no sense asking a member of the Communist Party in the 50s, what are you trying to achieve? The answers would be more or less self-evident. I'm trying to gain power. If revolution doesn't happen, at least I want to have more power in the parliament because I want to impose 1, 2, 3. Whereas if you would go, for example, to the Occupy campaign and ask the people, what do you want to achieve? Sometimes this question would met with skepticism. So the idea of what is to be done, to put it in Lenin's terms, in the old left it was something which was clear and central in their narrative. In the new left it's something which is sometimes not even a question that is to be asked.
Interesting. So when we're talking about old and new left, when you say old left, do you mean pre-1960s left, or is there an earlier demarcation point?
I would say the mass movements of the early 20th century, the socialist and the communist movement of the early 20th century, which goes even a bit earlier than that. I would include in the old left even, for example, the Spanish anarchists of 36, although they were so much opposite to the left of their time, like the Stalinists. And I would include in the old left the Orthodox communist parties, even after the 60s. For example, I would include the Greek Communist Party or the French Communist Party until the 70s in the old left. But more or less, it's the socialist and the communist movements of the 20th century.
Okay, so if we were going to compare, say, something like in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party manifesto versus, say, a Labour Party manifesto from the old left, what would the differences be?
That's a good question, which I'm not the best person to answer because I'm not very familiar with Corbyn's plan.
Okay.
I would say you would see many things in common in terms of plans about the economy. For example, nationalization of rails. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a good idea, but that's for a different discussion. But this is something which is in common. So part of the appeal that Corbyn has is that he has with him this aura of the economic reformer. That the moment I come to power, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. Which, for example, was not the case with a new leftist party in power, as was Syriza in Greece. Also, Corbyn has with him this idea that we can rediscover these working class communities and somehow from a top down reinvigorate these working class communities. So he has this appeal in this working class legacy and memory of this country. Again, maybe all this is posturing, maybe this will make things for working class even worse, but that doesn't matter for what we're discussing here. What matters is that he's playing by this book. He has these very clear references to the old left. And the thing that would be different is his focus on things like identity or things like diversity, which again, you can think they're good, you can think they're bad, but we have to agree it's something new. So this would be a difference. So Corbyn looks like a guy who is bridging the old left with a new left not in a good, but in a successful way.
Okay, so is it sort of simplistic to say old left just means socialism, redistribution of wealth, more union rights, and so on, but without the identity politics and without the kind of anti-free speech stuff that you see in the newer left? Is that the distinction, really, or is it more subtle than that?
I hate to say it's always more complicated because it looks like we don't want to give an answer, but it is definitely more complicated. For example, the new left starts with many, I would even say, libertarian themes. Free speech, civil rights, rights for minorities, which is excellent. In a way, the new left looked like a breath of fresh air. It looked. The problem is, was these claims for more individual autonomy, was this by default, and were there merely slogans, or were they following from a clear philosophical understanding of the world that says this is what we have to, in order to live and flourish, you need these rights, and therefore we support these rights. I think it was on the former. It was more like a default kind of reaction, but this doesn't mean it was a bad thing. The problem is that it was not principled, so it didn't really bring the results that it had to bring. But also, I would reverse the question. We see a lot of things that we would consider as unique to the new left. We see them in the old left. For example, my Marxist friends freak out when I say that. What about this link between the idea of Marxian false consciousness or proletarian consciousness with the things that the intersectional feminists are saying today? That if you're a woman, you have a different understanding of the world, than if you're a man. Therefore, if you're a man, how can you speak? Well, is this miles away from the Marxist view of, let's say, bourgeois consciousness or proletarian consciousness? Or, for example, the idea that this piece of research is to be dismissed because it's, quote, bourgeois research. That was a typical Stalinist line. Whereas today, you say this is a white male research, therefore it is to be dismissed. So I am more and more cautious to draw these clear lines between old left and new left. However, the book is 2 years old, so almost 2 years old. So when I was writing it, I didn't have these things clear in my mind. So I think today I would be way more critical of these claims by the old left and way more cautious to clarify things like the first question who asked, what do we really mean by enlightenment, modernity, and things like that? So I think my book is a good criticism of the new left, but it should be way more, it should be stricter in its criticism of the old left.
What would you say about the idea that actually you have three lefts? So there's the pre-1960s left, there's the 60s and 70s left, and then there's today's left. And today's left departs markedly from the 60s left, in that the 60s left is all about treating people as individuals rather than equality of outcome. The 60s left is all about risk-taking, whereas today's left is all about protecting the vulnerable and minimizing risk, and things like that.
I would say that on an observational level, this is true. On a philosophical level, this is not true, because every single thing, almost every single thing, which is wrong with today's left, comes from the metaphysical or the epistemological beliefs of the new left. By metaphysical, I mean what is the nature of reality. Epistemological, I mean how do we acquire knowledge. For example, when you see this relativism in the new left, which says
the 60s left?
Sorry?
Do you mean the 60s left by new left?
Yes, I mean the 60s left. When you see, for example, the relativism, which says there is no one truth. My truth is, for example, doing drugs. My truth is to experiment with this. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad. And if you add this, for example, with French 1970s philosophy, deconstruction, breaking down universals, then you have this vacuum of basically emptiness, of nothing being secure, of nothing being certain. And then, if we cannot communicate by reason, then communication is not impossible, which is not possible, which then means that how do we decide who is right and who is wrong? It's a bit like with religions. Why do you have religious wars? Again, I know that's simplistic, but I'm saying on a very basic level. There is no other way to solve these differences, right? So when you take reason out of the table, then the only means available to sort out politics or to sort out philosophical differences or tensions is power, is force. Sooner or later. Or a retreat that says nothing can be done to the world out there, therefore I will retreat inside here. And I will make all these subjectivist choices, but only for myself. But when I engage with other people, then the only way to engage is force. My favorite example from today's world was a light bulb moment for me. It was last year when Ben Shapiro, the conservative pundit, commentator, yes, he went to Berkeley. By the way, up to this point, I had no idea who Ben Shapiro was. There was almost a small-scale war outside the university because they didn't want to allow him to talk. They had to pay ridiculous expenses in security. But here's the interesting thing. Some of the protesters said things like, Shapiro is an alt-right white nationalist who is a danger to the physical safety of students. Now, first of all, this is ridiculous. Shapiro is like a 5'2" classical liberal Jew who, isn't a physical danger to anyone. But here's the very interesting thing. If he's a physical danger to other people, if someone is a physical danger to me, this legitimizes me to do what? To use violence. Because if someone's speech or if someone's presence somewhere is a danger to my safety, I have all the right to use violence. This is how you open the Pandora's box. This is how any possible communication becomes impossible. And this is when the floodgates to violence is open. Now trace the epistemology of this idea back, and you'll find irrationalism and subjectivism that was so prominent in the 60s, that's the only logical conclusion, unfortunately.
Okay, what would you say to this objection? You're right that the irrationalism and subjectivism was quite popular in 60s theory and 60s academia and so on, but in terms of the activism and the cultural impact the 60s made, if we were to give that activism and that cultural impact a voice, it would say, don't assume that minorities all have the same explanation of how oppressed they are. So you can't say that Ben Shapiro was a threat to them without de-individuating them in some way and accusing them of all having the same thoughts. And that would be prejudice and bigotry.
But what matters is not your thoughts. Now I will sound like Shapiro. Facts don't care about your feelings. But here's the thing, you might be thinking, for example, that aliens are after us.
Yeah.
Or you might be thinking that there's a huge conspiracy by the Illuminati to take it down. Mm-hmm. In my book, not in the actual book, I mean in my mind, this is of equal ridiculousness as saying that Shapiro is a white nationalist who is a physical threat to students of minorities. So the fact that someone believes it, this means they have to do some serious self-questioning, because this is clearly something which has no relevance to the facts of reality. The arbiter has to be reality. The arbiter cannot be your feelings. I mean, feelings are important. If I hurt someone's feelings, I will ask myself, what did I do? I will question what I do. Or if my feelings are not in harmony with reality, I'll have to dig deep and see what happens. But this doesn't mean that they are a genuine tool of understanding reality. So if your feelings are telling you that Shapiro is a white nationalist, then I would say check your premises, check your feelings, check your sense of reality.
Oh, of course. But do you not see anything in the 60s, not the theory, but the culture, that would be supporting Shapiro in this instance and saying don't treat all minorities as if they have the same understanding of how they're victims?
Well, the easy way for me to get out of this difficult question has always been to say that, for example, I don't consider the civil rights movement the same thing as the 60s counterculture.
Okay.
Because for example, the civil rights movement, of course it started earlier, you see people who attack a profound injustice. If I were around back then, hopefully, because as Peterson says, you can never know what you do in a time of oppression, but hopefully I'll be on the barricades. I would be protesting for civil rights and clashing with racists and white supremacists. However, this comes from a position of reason and individual rights, that there's a huge group of people that our country, with the philosophy behind it, which is beautiful, it's a philosophy of individual rights and we're all equal as citizens, but there's this blind spot because it doesn't apply to this group. This is vastly unjust and we need to change it. I'm not sure how this is the same with all the May 68 slogans, that we demand the impossible. No, they didn't demand the impossible. They demanded something very coherent and simple. Equal rights for every individual in this country.
So this is interesting. So I'm going to now talk a bit about 60s counterculture now that you brought it up. And what seems to be a difference between 60s counterculture and today in the domain of sexual liberation. Now, both 60s counterculture and the modern left are both heavily influenced by the feminism of their time. But it seems like the feminism of the 60s and the feminism of today, despite their similarities, have at least one big difference. The feminism of the 60s would have told a woman, for instance, sleep with whoever you want to, show off your body whoever you want to, if it was sex-positive feminism, rather than sex-negative feminism that was all about objectification. Whereas sex-positive feminism today wouldn't just be telling a woman, do what you want, it would be telling wider society, you must approve and validate her. That if you have any questions about her, if you think she is obnoxious in her sexuality, if you use the term slut and so on, you need to be stigmatized and perhaps punished even. How would you explain this difference between one movement saying do what you want and the other movement saying you must be supported and agreed with when you do what you want?
First of all, I would say that this is one of the things that you're doing very well, which is spotting these small things that make such a huge difference. This is something which is rarely being mentioned, and it's so important. That the main difference is that in the 60s, this urge for liberation comes from a genuine idea that I can live my life and I don't need the approval of the world.
Yes.
It's like I'm showing a finger to the world, right? Like, if you don't accept me, go away, I will do my thing. You know I'm a fan of Ayn Rand novels. This reminds me Howard Rourke, the architect in The Fountainhead, who says, I will not go by your standards, I will go by my standards. Now, we can say that maybe the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, let's say, standards are not the proper ones. But this idea that I will go with my standards, there is something genuine in it. The only problem is that your standards need to be good. So I will say that there's definitely a difference, that today it looks like these movements want recognition. But what kind of recognition? Not recognition in terms of recognize my rights, which is 100% correct. I mean, if you have some individual rights, I'm not talking about group rights, because if you respect individual rights, you don't need group rights. If there's a group, for example, if you cannot, if because you belong to a minority, you cannot do that something that someone else does, for example, take a loan or things like that, or even I would say marry whoever you want, whatever of sex or gender. Yes, then more power to you. But if it's an urge to recognize me, this means that you want to get value from without, not from within. And this, I would say, is the opposite of self-esteem. Mm-hmm. Self-esteem, I mean in the general term, not this kind of new age idea. Self-esteem comes from within. It's I believe what I stand for. I stand by my choices, and get away and don't stop me. Don't stop me. Okay. Whereas today, it looks like the mantra is not "don't stop me." The mantra looks to be get out of your way so that you validate my value or my self-esteem or my identity. And again, a lot of people will say, yes, this is illiberal, this is annoying. For me, the number one warning sign is, what about these people themselves? Someone who wants validation from without, I don't think this is a very healthy way to lead your life, because you can never get self-esteem. Because self-esteem can only come from this pride that I can stand up to what life demands and I can achieve things. It cannot come from other people recognizing you or giving you validation. Of course, when I do something good, I like that people I respect and I love, give me the thumbs up or give me a pat in the back. But this is not central in my attention. So you're 100% right. This is something which is different from the ethos of the 60s, which was more daring, more courageous. Again, maybe not always for the right reasons. I mean, there's no point being courageous if courageous mean I'm going to get high in LSD and walk on the cliff of a skyscraper. Right. Like this scene in Forrest Gump, for example. But as put in the right context, this is a good attitude. This daring and experimenting attitude.
Okay, so what would you say to, let's say, someone who is critiquing what we're saying, who says, in order to truly be free to do anything, whether it's drugs or sex or whatever, you can't really do it if people are hostile toward you and critical. You need validation in order to be able to express yourself in those choices, or else there's no point in having formal freedoms to be able to do porn or do drugs or whatever else you might want to do. What would you say to that criticism?
I would say that this is an anti-reality principle. It says that the world needs to be bent towards my will. The proper attitude, I will repeat what I said earlier, is go away and let me do what I want to do, as long as I don't infringe your right. But it comes down to what is the definition of freedom. The definition of freedom, for me, we have to be very objective. Words have meanings. Freedom means freedom from coercion. It doesn't mean freedom from reality. For example, I don't accept the argument that says, if I have to work for food, I'm not free. No, your nature as human being requires us to take action to survive. Survival is not automatic. We have to think, we have to understand the world, we need to produce stuff, our clothes, our shelter, our food. Therefore, I cannot say I'm not free because I have to provide clothes to myself. This would be, this is a revolt against reality. This is not a revolt against society or oppression. So I do not accept the argument that says that for me to express myself, I need the validations of others. I need others not trying to lynch me, but here we talk about physical force, which is something objective, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, put simply, imagine how weird would it be if I say that because I believe in this, let's say, pro-freedom, pro-individualist philosophy, I expect each one of my colleagues and my students and the staff in the university to read the things to read Ayn Rand and to respect my views. No. The only thing I want from them is not to make my life difficult in terms of, I don't throw urine in my door as they did with some other professor somewhere else, or to hit me with a club on the head. That's all I expect from them. Or lie and libel my views. That's all I expect. Otherwise, it's not empowering, it's disempowering. Because it's not up to me, it's up to other people. The most empowering thing is when your validation and your self-esteem comes from within. There's nothing more empowering than that. If this now comes from without, this is not empowering. This is basically you give your power away. You become a second-hander.
So would you reject the argument that, say, the reason you can wear a beard in public, the reason a woman can wear a bikini at the beach, and so on, is because they have validation from society, that loads of people aren't simply snickering at them and insulting them and saying, ew, and that's why they can do these things? You think that's not true, that even if people were snickering and insulting them, they'd still eventually be able to have the freedoms that we all enjoy in terms of how to dress and so on?
So, yeah, let me be fair to the 1960s. The relaxation of judgment around sexuality is definitely something that we need to pay tribute to the 60th generation. This was something positive. But this has to do with creating a culture which is more tolerant. My fear is that as we become more and more and more and more obsessed with validation about our choice from other people, our society will become more intolerant. You see it already. A poster, for example, with a quote, unrealistic body image, is not anymore allowed in London Tube. This doesn't sound like this is a result of this idea that there's something out there that I don't approve, and this means that it cannot be there. I really like sometimes some photos when you see, like, say, from the 70s, there's a beach with some nude, with people who are naked, and then, let's say, on the background, there's an old lady who looks very, very annoyed. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a funny picture, but also I find it a nice picture because the counter, like the meta conclusion from this photo is, well, I don't like it, but yeah, this beach has space for both of us.
So the woman in the bikini.
If you say, I'm going to ban these posters, or if you have these ideas, you're not coming to my university, it's the opposite. It's like saying this city or this university is not big enough for both of us.
So in a way, the woman in the bikini is tolerating being stared at with a nasty look by the old woman, whereas the modern progressive woman in the bikini would not be tolerating that old woman.
Well, it's a bit like that. Yeah, in the one case, because again, tolerance doesn't mean acceptance. Mm-hmm. I'm not even sure if I like the term tolerance. I mean, Frank Furedi has an interesting book on the topic. For example, I don't tolerate anti-Semites. I don't tolerate homophobics. But this doesn't mean, and also I don't respect them. That's why I don't like the term respect. I don't respect these people. But this doesn't mean I go out with trying to smash their heads, mm-hmm. and if they're not violent. So that's why I'm not even sure if the term tolerance, because tolerance means also acceptance. So in a way, I don't accept them, but I accept that they have rights, and I cannot infringe these rights.
So then the woman in the bikini isn't tolerant of the old woman sneering at her. She's tolerant of the rights of the old woman to be there and sneer at her.
And vice versa. And the old woman the religious woman is not, quote, tolerating the other person. She just recognizes that she has a right to be there without being harassed. I do think, for example, that sometimes speech is violence. If I tell you I'm going to burn your house, or if I tell you, for example, my mafia guys are after you, this is clearly violence. So this is a difficult discussion, but let's agree, when we say, for example, tolerance, I mean this thing that I recognize your right to do it, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I respect it.
So is this kind of old-fashioned tolerance that you see in the 70s photo, is this something that the 60s left and the old left would have in common, that the new left would be departing from?
Well, I'm not sure about the old left, to be honest. The old left had some other good things that the modern left lacks. For example, my favorite thing in the old left is this heroic attitude. For example, you see in the Soviet films the Stakhanovite hero who wants to double the production. Now, within that context, we recognize that this is ridiculous propaganda, because actually if the Stakhanovite hero wouldn't do it, he would find himself in trouble, and also he does it for a collective and for a regime which is illegitimate and should be toppled and shouldn't be supported. But as a sense of life, as someone who's, let's say, 16 years old, and see this guy who wakes up early, goes to work early, is productive, he wants to be the best. This is something which is very, very lacking from today's left. Today's left talk about, for example, universal basic income as if you have a right. And my problem with this is, it's not the economic, it's where is the spirit? Where is the spirit of creation? Where is the spirit of, and they say, for example, but today's they're bullshit jobs. Well, being a coal miner doesn't sound very exciting, but there was this ethos that in order to survive and thrive, I need to do stuff. I need to do productive stuff. So I really like the working class hero image of the old left, which, for example, is lacking in the modern left and definitely in the new left. But whether the old left was tolerant, experience says no. I mean, see LGBT rights in socialist countries. It's quite simple, and it's not even controversial. It's not like, for example, a Stalinist is going to say, this is lie, and actually in East Germany, for example, it was perfectly okay to be openly gay or something. But again, I don't want to use this as an argument against socialism. We have way more arguments against socialism, because in most of the Western countries, LGBT rights at that time were not respected either. So this is not something unique to the old left. But you could say, specifically in Greece, traditionally they're clearly way more conservative. For example, the Communist Party type people from the new left type people. And this has the positives, which is they are more, they have this work ethos and all that stuff. And it has the negatives, which is they're socially more intolerant.
What would you say to somebody who at this point in the dialectic is getting very confused because they think, well, the left, whether it's old or new, is supposed to be anti-capitalist, and you're describing the old left as though it seems pro-capitalist. What's going on here?
It's not pro-capitalist, it's pro-productiveness, because they recognize that the world out there is to be shaped under our will. There's this famous Trotsky claim that George Monbiot the other day used as to attack Spiked, more power over nature, less power over man. But there's an even better quote by Francis Bacon. It's probably one of my favorite quotes, which says, nature has to be obeyed in order to be controlled, basically, something like that. Now my mind is stuck, although I use it all the time, which basically means we have to shape nature based on our will, and to do this we have to understand this. The same applies to the world. If I want to survive for the winter, I need to build, let's say, a dam. I need to have very good industrial style agriculture to feed millions of people. This requires technology. This requires work. This requires productivity.
Is the old left pro-industrialization and pro-economic growth?
Clearly, you can see this in the Stalinist propaganda, for example. There's this, again, that's why I have this guilty pleasure as a critic of ideology to watch Stalin's films. Most of these films, for example, the first scene is some huge factories. Again, we know within the context that this was a horrible regime and these films were dirty propaganda. But there's something very interesting in what would sell well to these people. For example, usually there was this film which was about the Battle of Berlin, and it starts from the 30s Soviet Union. The first scene is a school is visiting a factory. Today this would be unimaginable. Today we visit recycle centers, and they visit the factory, which is like all health and safety hazards, and the kids are like, wow, look, this is a miracle. So yes, clearly pro technology, clearly pro industriousness. Now there's a very big question whether left totalitarianism, which is very central in the old left, is on the long term compatible with an industrial society. My answer would be probably no, but this is a can of worms, so let's leave it for another discussion.
This is interesting. It seems like one of the hallmarks of the left, whether we're talking about the new left or the old left, is the idea that one of the problems with capitalism is it's inherently coercive. That is, if you are starving, if you're poor, if you don't want to be homeless, you are compelled to produce things that might not have anything to do with what you want to do or what best expresses your talents, for instance. So, somebody who is best suited playing the violin or being a dancer might have to, because of capitalism, have to go out and work grueling hours in a factory. Has the left not always been promoting that idea? Is the old left in some ways saying it's better to be coerced to work in the factory rather than play the violin?
No matter when they make this claim, again, this is a false premise. This is a false claim because it requires reality to bend in your whim, not on your actions. For example, you can say, I'm going to work in McDonald's and then play the violin, which is okay. But this basically says, I want to play the violin no matter what. And other people need to do something for me to play the violin. Now, careful. If you cannot play the violin because, for example, the government doesn't allow you to work, or because a tribe in a civil war has enslaved you, then yes, you have to blame the system. But this is never the case with the criticism of capitalism. Usually it is, I have to work for a living, and I have to sell my labor. No, you don't have to sell your labor. Feel free to do something else. Odds are you can't, which is quite often not the responsibility of capitalism. For example, the fact that I cannot work for myself in Greece has nothing to do with capitalism. So my next best option is indeed to sell my labor. There's nothing wrong with it. And it means that it's better than my second best choice. Again, if this is because I live in a system where my rights are violated or where horrible things are happening, then yes, let's revolt. But if this is because no one wants to pay me basically to pay the violin, then no, you don't have a right to this. And actually, I take it a step further. To claim that you have a right is an assault, first of all, to you as a person. It completely disempowers you. This leftist narrative is taking away any empowerment from you, because it's basically other people do stuff for me. My survival is based, and my flourishing is based on other people taking positive action to do something for me. This claim that in capitalism you cannot be free, of course, is a theme that goes from the old left to the new left. But the old left would have, let's say, for example, in Spain, they have the excuse of confusing, for example, the semi-feudal system with the church and the oligarchs with capitalism. The new left haven't got this excuse. It's very clear nowadays what it means to live in an industrial capitalist society, and you don't have this excuse anymore to let's say, to confuse who is your oppressor.
So you obviously don't agree with this argument, but you would concede that this argument is something that you see on the old as well as the new left?
Yes, this argument is seen also in the on left, but this doesn't stop it from being a false argument. This is why Marx talks about this idea of being a fisherman in the morning, a poet in the evening, a hunter in the afternoon. It's this idea that the ideal society is one which allows you to do whatever you want. Of course, the problem is that if you're a fisherman in the morning, a hunter in the evening, and a poet in the midnight, then odds are you're going to be a crappy fisherman, hunter, and poet. I would prefer a society that I would focus on the thing I'm doing best.
Okay, what would you say to, let's say, a feminist argument, a socialist feminist argument that says, okay, there might be a beautiful woman somewhere in a poor community. She needs to go to school to become a chemist or a theoretical physicist where she's going to make some important breakthrough, but she needs money she doesn't have. And because she's young and beautiful, the only thing that people are going to pay her for is to commodify her sexuality. Is that a society in which she's free?
Well, this sounds like a mellow Greek 1950s film kind of narrative, but let's see what happens there. So the first question is, why is this community so poor that no one can help her? There's no benevolence there. She hasn't got relatives, friends. There's no one there. Everyone is poor. Why is everyone poor? Is everyone poor, for example, because, as it happens in Greece, they made disastrous political choices, and for example, they voted for a guy who promised them everyone's going to be a millionaire, and there's a way that it's going to rain money from the sky. Because this is how usually you find yourself in this situation. Now, if you take, for example, someone in the developing world, which you could say this is how things are happening. I think in this case it's more realistic. But again, if you have, for example, a very if you're very talented in violin, it's highly unlikely that no one is going to recognize your talent. It's highly unlikely that you cannot work in the day somewhere else and then play the violin. Now, is this easy? Is this fair? But fair in what way? For example, is it fair that this person was born in Bangladesh and not in Manhattan? It makes no sense to say fair because it's not the result of someone's actions. Or the fact that my grandfather was born in the beginning of the 20th century and had to go and had to see 2 world wars and a civil war. Is it fair? No, it is what it is. That's why I said it's very important, your view of reality. There's no point in saying it's very unfair that this person was born there. We deal with the situations we find ourselves in, trying to do our best.
Okay, but I mean, what if this woman in this hypothetical scenario feels like she lives in an unfree, unjust world because the thing that she's most talented for is harder to get money to do than something which she finds degrading? Is she wrong?
Is she wrong to be, for example, sad? No, she's not wrong.
Is she wrong to feel she's morally justified in believing she lives in an oppressive society that she should fight against, where the source of the oppression is the capitalist demands on her?
First of all, most poor societies are poor because of something that had to do historically with oppression. Not necessarily oppression by the colonialist or whatever, but with some injustice. Okay? So yes, but again, what can you do about that? If the oppression is present, go revolt against it. For example, if the reason you cannot become a violinist is because you're a black person in the American South in the 50s, not only you have a moral right to revolt, anyone who is a good person should also revolt with you, because this is a horrible injustice. But this is not the same as it's unfair that I cannot play the violin because I'm poor. It's within a context.
So what would you say to this woman if she said she's campaigning for a basic income, because if she gets a basic income, it'll be a lot easier for her to become a chemist and eventually get paid for it than have to waste her time doing modeling or working at Hooters or whatever as a waitress? What would you say to that?
Basic income is a good idea only insofar as it's voluntary. Because otherwise, the underlying claim is that by being in this world, other people owe you something. Now, the only people who owe me something is people who have done something wrong and need to pay for it. And it stops somewhere there. The idea that the person who is a plumber or a businessman or a basketball player owes you money so that you don't go and work in the pub is wrong. Go there, try to engage the rationality, explain them, look, I'm so good, this is my dream, I'm a good person, or I'm going to repay you, whatever, and do it. But don't demand the unearned from other people. Don't say to other people, by the mere fact that I exist and I have these wills, this will is a claim in your life, because our time is our life. No matter if you're a billionaire and you have to give away 1% of your income, or you're a plumber and you have to give away 0.1% of your income, this is time from your life. Your life is yours. Your life is no one else's. Your life is not the end, the means to someone else's ends. Your life is only the means to your ends. Again, as long as you don't violate or attack other people.
Okay, so is your position then that the talented chemist doesn't deserve to demand from others that she have the resources financially to be able to become that chemist, that she's got to earn it out?
She deserves to ask for it. She doesn't deserve to demand it. Unless these people have done something wrong. For example, in the American South, if even after the civil rights have been recognized, you have a right to spot who were the thugs who have assaulted you and require their punishment, and even more, and actually also require compensation. But you cannot require this from random people just because they happen to have something that you need.
Interesting. And in this way, maybe you're departing from the old left as well as the new left. So we're going to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to discuss the history of the left's transformation from the 60s to the present. Okay, welcome back to part 2 of this podcast, in which we're going to discuss the history of the left's transformation a bit more in concrete terms. What exactly happened in the 1960s that suddenly turned the left away from productivity and growth and started to be suspicious of those things and see them as part of capitalist oppression?
So my conspiratorial explanation is that this has to do with the fact that it was clear that socialism had lost the fight from capitalism when it comes to which is the system that delivers the goods. That's one aspect. Another aspect is that these anti-materialist, anti-modernity, anti-enlightenment tendencies were already present in the 30s in some more marginal circles, intellectual circles, for example in Paris or in the counterculture of these countries, and then they started gaining ground. They started coming to the forefront. So it's political reasons, but also it's intellectual reasons, and also it has to do with the fact that if we see, for example, Frankfurt School, which was so central in this shift in the left, this idea that modernity has led to the disaster of totalitarianism and the Second World War, which is an argument that I really, really cannot understand. It's an argument that is also made by non-leftists like Jordan Peterson, who say, for example, that too much rationality or rationalism leads to the disaster of the 20th century, which is, it makes no sense whatsoever. The disaster of the 20th century have at its root irrationality, lack of reason, tribalism, the ideal of self-sacrifice, which is not an ideal in a good sense. So these are at the epicenter of totalitarianism. But anyway, there was this confused idea that if we take all these modernity values, they will lead to disasters. So it's these three things: the defeat of socialism in terms of its legitimacy, the intellectual tendencies that were already strong, and this fresh memory from the Holocaust and the disasters, and the fear of, for example, a nuclear war that made these people more skeptical of materialism.
Now, in the Frankfurt School, you often see a term bandied about, instrumental rationality, by which it's meant it's not rationality in the sense of deciding what is best to do. It's rationality in terms of satisfying certain aims where the aims are not particularly questioned, and rationality becomes itself a kind of technical exercise to actualize any aims, no matter how horrible or how inhumane. Are you against that kind of rationality, or do you think instrumental rationality is okay?
The way you put it, it's one of the things that I've been struggling with, but I think now that you put this way, it's the first time that I clearly understand in my head. I would call it out of context rationality. For example, if I'm a brilliant scientist and KGB asks me to build a torture chamber and I do it, I have to use my reason, but it's out of context. Because if I integrate the context, what I'm doing is opposed to reason. I want this torture chamber to crush people's reason. So I would say I accept the term instrumental rationality if it means this rationality which is out of context. For example, the Holocaust had an industrious level of efficiency, which is something horrible. So the fact that someone was good in building the extermination centers doesn't mean this is they have to use the reason, but they use the reason to destroy values such as life and reason. So it is not. I would call it out of context rationality.
So do you think that the Frankfurt School was mistaken in believing that the problem with capitalism is it promotes out of context rationality, at least the 20th century version of capitalism that they're critiquing?
No, because all these disasters have nothing to do with capitalism. I'm yet to hear what is capitalists' achievements that are created by out of context rationality. I 100% recognize this argument for the Holocaust. I recognize it for the NKVD torture chambers in Soviet Union. I cannot see how it relates to capitalism.
What would you say to somebody who says that the way that it relates is that capitalism is all about maximizing profit at the expense of people?
There are two problems with that. First of all, how can you maximize profit against people? The only way in a capitalist society where you can become rich is that you create something that serves other people's needs. Except, for example, if you cut deals with the government or you break other people's rights, which is, for example, you pollute rivers, whatever, these kind of caricature examples, which are already illegal and they should be. And if it has to do with government coercing others or stopping others from competing with you, then it's not capitalism and it should be criticized. But this idea that capitalism is about profit, there's this argument that I hear all the time. We don't want a system that is about maximization of profit. As opposed to that, to what? Like, you're after what? A system which is about maximization of losses? So it's a slogan which I never managed, even in my leftist days, I couldn't really understand what it meant.
Mm-hmm. So then you don't think that it's possible to profit in a way where you get the money you need from people, but for most people, your influence on them is one where you're coercing them, you're gaining their labor, you're paying them poor wages, and you're living the high life. You don't think that's possible in a capitalist society?
It's 100% possible, but I would not use the term coerce, because this is not coercion. Mm-hmm. Let's take the Wolf of Wall Street. This guy is first of all, is a horrible capitalist, and this guy is 100% unselfish. He's not selfish. He's unselfish. He's doing self-destructive things. His model of operation is short-term. He's trying to operate by screwing other people. This is a recipe of disaster on the long term. He has destroyed his business, his marriage, himself, and he ended up in prison. This is a caricature of capitalism, and actually this is a horrible capitalism. Gordon Gekko and Wall Street would be a more difficult and nuanced example, but my argument remains that if you do the things that you mentioned, it's not coercion, and if you do coercive or irrational or unselfish things, then either you're illegal, so you're sabotaging yourself, or even if you're not illegal, you're still sabotaging yourself. You're doing something which is against what reality requires from you. To maximize profits, for example, reality requires from you that you're not under the influence of cocaine 24/7, or that all your productivity go to sex orgies where you do all sorts of ridiculous things. So this caricature version of capitalism has nothing to do. Capitalism is about how can I create something that a lot of people will want to use.
So do you think that, for instance, people who have a lot of money, who run multinational corporations, who pay people lower wages than what would be desirable, are not greedy, that something else is going wrong?
They might be greedy, but I don't see what the problem of being greedy is. Mike Phelps is really greedy. He didn't stop in the 10 Olympic medals. He wanted more. Good for him. Tesla was greedy. Einstein was greedy. So I'm using the term in a good way. LeBron James is greedy. He wants to become the best of all times. The same thing would apply also to a CEO or to a hedge fund manager. My only question is, are you doing things that are rational, which means that they're good? Because, for example, if you're trying to buddy up with a legislator and destroy your competitors, then you're shooting on your own leg. Sooner or later, this is going to turn against you. You're trying to use basically force or fraud against others, in which case you're despicable. In every other case, I wouldn't see why greed is a problem.
So if you are a greedy capitalist, fundamentally, that's not going to be very successful for you in the long run, because capitalism is responsive to the demands of people trying to cross-check your greed. Is that your view?
Yeah, again, it depends on how we use greed. But okay, I gave you an example from Hollywood, although it's a real story. But think about Bernie Madoff, the personification of greed. This led him to prison. I'm not sure, I think someone in his family killed himself out of embarrassment from all this scandal. And he's the guy, the name of whom we use when we want to talk about the fraudster. Now, this doesn't sound very selfish and, quote, greedy to me. This sounds, again, like a recipe of disaster. So this is more of a Hollywood caricature image of capitalism rather than of real capitalists. Real capitalists are the people who, wake up. They're the Stakhanovites, let's say, of the real world. They wake up early, they want to create more. Of course, you might say, yes, they pay their workers low wages. First of all, the fact that their workers work there means that their second best choice is even worse. So this is why sometimes I'm annoyed by people accusing McDonald's. They say McDonald's gives city jobs. Or someone says, I've worked for McDonald's for many years and my job sucks. Well, this clearly means that you didn't have another choice. And instead of blaming the person or the rest of society, whoever you want, based on your beliefs, it makes no sense blaming specifically McDonald's, who are the only people who actually give you this horrible, or maybe not horrible, I don't know, job. So sometimes the way we frame this discussion about the, quote, responsibility of capitalists is a bit weird. It's definitely biased. And again, for example, the responsibility lies only with your employer if you're... It's very weird.
So we can see, on your view, the critique of out-of-context rationality you think is misplaced, but it's had a huge impact on the left. There's a second substantial change in the left that happens in the 60s, which very much influences the left now, and progressivism especially, and that is the turn against consumption and consumerism. Why do you think that happened in the 60s?
This is very important because it's also linked with environmentalism. I think this has its roots in the assault on reason. Because here's the chain of events. Reason is impossible, or reason is, let's say, an illusion, they say. Therefore, people are not to be trusted. Therefore, people are unreasonable. Therefore, the choice people are making are wrong. And now, add in this explosive mix your despair that capitalism is delivering the goods. Mix these things up and see what comes up. What comes up is the new left and its anti-consumerist moralism. Marcuse says it openly. He has a line, which is a direct quote, where he says it's a problem when the worker and the boss go to the same restaurants, read the same newspapers, and drive the same cars. I challenge you to find me one quote by a Carnegie or a Rockefeller or a, quote, robber baron, which is so elitist as this line, which says it's a problem that the worker and the boss drive the same cars, they go to the same bars, and they read the same newspapers.
Whereas it seems like the old left would applaud that. They would see that as progress.
Or they would frame it differently. They would definitely not say it's a problem. And this also shows me a deep distrust of people. That in this, I would say, I don't want to call it totalitarian, that's a strong word. This authoritarian urge to control people. This urge to tell people your choices are wrong, but I'm not making this criticism from the level of, I don't know, your analyst or your friends, but from a frame of there needs to be political change, which means there needs to be control, which means there needs to be coercion. That's why I find this not only bad, morally reprehensible.
So it seems like there's kind of two things which jumpstart this anti-consumerism. The second of which is environmentalism, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the first of which seems to be that what you see in the 50s and 60s with the beatniks and the hippie movement, you see this a lot in rock and roll records and in movies, is there's a sense that like consumerism, the plentifulness of products, has made the world quite complacent and stupid and warlike, and advertisements are constantly selling people things, shaping how they see themselves in a very idiotic fashion, and it's making the world a much more bland, homogenized, robotic place rather than a much more vibrant and dynamic place. That's a critique you see a lot in the art and the literature and the poetry and the films and the music of the 50s and 60s and 70s. Why do you think artists especially had this particular influence on changing the left's take on consumerism?
So you mean why it was mostly the artists rather than the intellectuals? Because I would say they were hand in hand.
Both.
And there's this brilliant scene. Have you watched Mad Men, the TV series?
Yeah.
I think it's in season 1. It's one of my best scenes throughout all the seasons. It's John Draper is visiting one of his girlfriends, and there's a hippie there. And it's very interesting to see their interaction because I think there's something very kind of existential, not in the philosophical, but something very true and real there. Draper is very assured of himself, very in command of the situation, and the hippie seems in constant agony. And something is happening outside, and the hippie says something like, oh no, there are cops out there, you cannot go there. And Draper says in a very kind of cool and in control, says, no, you can go out there. And I see it as a metaphor for life overall. This hippie outlook in life is the world is a crazy place, and I don't have the tools, I don't have the arsenal to survive there. I don't have the tools to survive there. And this tools is reason. Whereas the technocrat, let's say, the quote capitalist, who uses his reason, of course Draper is irrational in all sorts of ways, but at least he recognizes the importance of reason. He's like, no, I can take that. I can assume control of life. So with the hippies, it's this celebration of a childish situation of life, which is someone needs to take care of me. And we see this in Woodstock. And what a beautiful poetic justice. In Woodstock, very soon they run out of food, they run out of water, and they're in a situation of almost primordial chaos. And the local sheriff needs to fly and send them and parachute them foods and stuff. So the people who are saying your world sucks and you're alienated are about to, they live in a situation of dirt and mess and orgy, and rationality in the face of the local sheriff needs to fly and drop them stuff to survive. I think these two scenes, the Don Draper scene and the Woodstock scene, capture the 60s and this counterculture at its best. It's the idea that the world is such a horrible place. You know, we just want to celebrate, we just want to have fun. To put it in Peterson's term, you just don't want to grow up. You want to live in this Pinocchio wonderland. How does he call it?
What would you say to somebody who says, well, there's certainly problems with that critique of consumerism. You're absolutely right. But it was an understandable response to the fact that at that time, advertising was very bland. And, you know, getting interesting cultural artifacts took a lot of work and a lot of headhunting. Going to places with like-minded people, if you grew up in the suburbs, wasn't so easy. And because people were railing against that in the 60s and 70s, we now have this post-internet world where culture is very much at your fingertips. You can tailor yourself to whatever advertisements you want. And the consumerist society is actually vibrant and dynamic in a way where people don't have a reason to complain about it now in the way that they did in the 50s and 60s. What would you say to that critique?
I would say this critique, if I understood it well, makes sense, that there was much more to be gained culturally in that world. And specifically if you live in the suburbs, it was not necessarily very good. But compared to what? Compared to what in the 40s, in the 30s, and the 20s? No, these things gave you more possibilities, more chances. And this is why this is how the American culture changed later, right? So these are the things. Consumerism, in a way, gives you more choices. The fact that I have this means that I can find like-minded people in New York, even if I have the most weird and obscure kind of hobby.
And for those of you who cannot see this, which would be virtually the entire audience, he's holding up an iPhone.
I'm holding up an iPhone. I'm holding up an iPhone. So, yes. So that's why I don't buy that critique. Because what is at the center of this critique? Like, what's the suggestion here? What are you hippies suggesting? Are you suggesting a monoculture? Are you suggesting a committee through which advertisements go? What's the point?
Well, do you think maybe they thought they were critiquing consumerism, but actually they were just critiquing the blandness of it? And because of the fact that that was a good thing to criticize, it's no longer bland today.
But I'm not convinced it was bland then.
You don't think it was?
Yeah. No, because bland compared to what? With what we had later?
Well, bland in the sense that, like, you can very easily purchase and have advertised towards you things that would be considered weird that are more highbrow than the X Factor. Whereas back then, it took more work to find those things, to be advertised, those things, to find communities of people who would go watch those things with you. It seems like the internet has very much obliterated that difficult work.
But excuse me, this was the golden era of every weird fringe counterculture, from the beatniks to the situationists to experimental films to Warhol style of art, all these things. There was an explosion at specifically the same time. And again, going back to Mad Men, the one is not unrelated to the other. You want to sell new things to people. You want to sell exciting things to people. Some of this counterculture is exciting. I mean, I really like rock. I really like some of the songs of the 60s, even the countercultural songs. I can't stand the beatniks, but that's another thing. But that's the thing. There's something for everyone. Mm-hmm. What's this Maoist phrase? Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Well, that's capitalism in a way. Throw your thing on the table. Put your thing on the table, and let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. Put your stuff out there, and let's see what you bring to the table.
Do you think maybe the reason why we're not in a period where there's a lot of experimentation culturally is just because there doesn't need to be, because the level of cultural diversity and easy access to those things has already been achieved, so you don't need a movement pushing for all of that?
Well, again, I don't accept the starting premise, which is that there is not enough experimentation today, if I understood well. Because, I mean, what we're doing would be not only impossible, I wouldn't even know you in a different time. Okay. We would live in different cities. So the mere fact that we're doing this, and thousands of others of people are doing this, or the fact that, think about it, we have mentors that we've never seen in real life. Mm-hmm. We have people whose lectures we watch on YouTube that we'll probably never see them. How great is that? People talk about alienation. I can talk 24/7 to my family in Greece from my phone, from Viber. I can have long distance romances or relationships. People who say we're alienated, I have no idea. I even struggle to understand what they're saying. So not only I reject the argument to begin with, I decline to even enter this argument.
Interesting. So then let's talk about probably the most influential anti-consumerist argument from the origins of the New Left, which you really see being hammered on social media today. And that is the idea that consumption as well as industrialization is fundamentally going to kill us all because it's dangerous for the planet. We need to scale back, reduce CO2 emissions and things of this nature. Where did this start?
Where did it start? I'm not sure exactly when it starts. We could say 1962 with Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring. But we know when it explodes. And it explodes in, Bjorn Lomborg has a good point on that, in 72, because we have the Club of Rome reports, limits to growth, we have fear of overpopulation, and we also have the energy crisis. None of these things has to do with over-consumerism or whatever. These were unfounded fears, and how do we know? Because they have, in the future, they were proven to be unfounded. Because, again, these people did not take into account our ability to think. And again, I would go to counterattack. I will not say fossil fuels and industrial civilization is a necessary evil. I will say it's a necessary good. And I talk specifically even about fossil fuels, because fossil fuel is the reason why so many billion of people have come out of poverty. And by the way, I would definitely recommend a book by a guy called Alex Epstein called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. It's one of the most frame-changing and mind-changing books I've read in my life. It's the one book that I've read by someone who's still alive, as opposed to some great philosophers of the past, or one of the books that I'd say, I wish I had this clarity of the mind to write this book. Because he makes this very argument that we would not even be here if it weren't for fossil fuels, for cheap energy, or for what these people call, quote, consumerism. Okay. And whoever has a doubt, just think 24 hours of your life without, quote, consumerism. Think about what happens when your heater goes off, or your boiler goes off, or even think what happens when your local Asda is closed. You think you're going to have a more communal life. First of all, there's nothing to celebrate for me in a communal life. I want my individuality and I want my privacy. So if you want communal life, more power to you. Go and do it. Don't impose it to me though. So again, there's this element of control that not only this is a lifestyle, but this is a lifestyle that you also need to have. Now, there are very reasonable concerns around pollution, around even climate change, mitigations, things that we could do better. For example, if you pollute the environment in a way that has some direct harm to someone, you infringe their rights, you have to pay, you have to compensate. But this should not be an existential attack on industrial civilization. an existential attack on capitalism.
What would you say to somebody who says all the latest science shows that things like fossil fuels and CO2 levels and current industrialization patterns just are not feasible, given what we know scientifically that the planet can do? We have to reduce emissions, we have to scale back in so many different ways in order to be able to keep having a habitable planet. We don't have all kinds of terrible things happening to people and mass migrations and climate disruptions that completely destroy the prosperity and the comfort that we currently have. And people who deny this are just sticking their fingers in the ears because they have an ideological axe to grind and they're closing their minds off to what is essentially not ideology but science. What would you say to that critique?
But what I would ask them is, what is your starting point? What is your frame of reference? My frame of reference is human beings. If you say that we need, for example, to switch away from fossil fuels, you're denying the right of developing countries to develop. And this is not a luxurious discussion on whether they're going to have cheap energy for their iPhones. This is literally an issue of life and death. Literally. If you see, for example, United Nations, World Health Organization reports, one of the biggest killers in the world is indoor pollution. Indoor pollution is caused by what? Not having access to electricity and having to burn animal skins or plastic or rubbish in order to cook and things like that. So cheap, reliable energy is an issue of life and death. At the moment, fortunately or unfortunately, the only cheap, reliable energy we have is fossil fuels. Nuclear is very, very reliable, unfortunately not cheap. Hydro is relatively cheap and reliable, but you need the proper environmental factors. Unfortunately, wind and solar is not cheap and is not reliable. You cannot industrialize a poor country with hydro and with solar. Therefore, I would say, let's put humans on the frame, individual human beings who want to live their life. We all have one life. We have to live it. We cannot say, I'm not going to live my life because I worry what might happen in 200 years. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to live our life at the best that we can, and then, again, use our minds and mitigate. You think that if we're reaching 100 years, we're not going to be able to resist the rise of sea levels of something reasonable, like 1.1 meter or something.
So what would you say to somebody who says the science is in, the majority of scientists agree, either we perfect wind and solar or we all die, and fossil fuels just aren't an option?
Yeah, first of all, no scientist says we're all going to die if we don't switch to... They make some predictions. I'm not questioning them. But these predictions, first of all, vary. It's one thing to say we're going to have a rise of 1 degree. Another thing to say we're going to have a rise of 5 degrees. For example, you have people who make documentaries and win Nobel Prizes. I don't know, did Al Gore win a Nobel Prize? I'm not sure. Who take the worst case scenario and then they present it as this is what the science says. Science doesn't tell us. Science tells us what will happen, but then the decision is up to us. Okay, and you can 100% agree with the science and yet understand that we need, for example, to focus on mitigating the consequences because we cannot do anything else. We cannot tell to poor people, you're not going to industrialize, you're not going to get the chances that we got, and you're not going to have cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy.
And you don't think that the scientific consensus is that we must do that or else we have no hope? You think that's a way that environmentalists have distorted the idea of what the scientific consensus is to the public?
Yes, because, again, the scientist gives you predictions. The role of the scientist is not to tell you we have no hope, unless they know something like, I don't know, an asteroid is coming. The scientist is going to tell you, if you do this, this is what will happen. And again, we don't question these things. But then, what you do on that is your decision. And also, it has to do with your values. Again, who do you put at the center of your frame? Because, for example, the fact that this is going to impact, let's say, let's say they impact the polar bears. I mean, that's unfortunate because polar bears are cute. Of course, polar bears are not going to be extinct. I'm just taking that as a ridiculous example. Mm-hmm. Now, still, we need to ask, what is the benefit that we're going to get from continue doing this? Let's say the benefit is that these countries are going to be rich and able to face the challenge. What is the downturn? It's going to have this impact, let's say, in polar bears, or this impact in the fact that you'll have to do these things. You take this into account and you take a decision. It's not that science is telling you, it's not like you do this and this and this and this and this. Science, the scientist, the philosopher, the political leader, all these people have different missions. The science has played its mission, has given us valuable information, but this doesn't mean that then everything is the discussion is over.
Do you think that there is a scientific consensus that we must lower CO2 emissions or else we're not going to survive for very longer? Or do you think that's a distortion based on environmentalist propaganda?
No, I wouldn't say it's a distortion. First of all, my knowledge on the exact of who says what is not up to a level where it would allow me to take publicly a position on that. I'm not taking this a position as an expert on environmentalism. I'm taking this position as someone who believes that he can think and who puts his values clearly on the table. My first and foremost value is life for individual human beings, their right to their life and their pursuit of their happiness. And because I look back and experience shows that scientists said that by now we'd be overpopulated, running out of food. Actually, some scientists, not all of them, running out of resources. Every time they were wrong. Why? Because they couldn't predict our imagination, our productivity, and the solutions that our minds can bring. And I'm very optimistic that if we let people alone to be productive and be creative, we're going to face this challenge as we faced way more difficult challenges in the past.
So do you think that it's better to take these environmental risks and rely on science to come up with solutions than to try and not take the risks and deal with the social and political consequences that come with not taking the risks and lowering the CO2 levels and things like that?
Okay, let's go with their narrative. Let's say we take Kyoto or Paris Agreement. Could someone tell me, not because, see, their narrative is always, we're going to lower CO2 by X amounts of tons. The answer I would want is, what is the impact this is going to have on the environment? If the impact within a century is 0.0001 degrees, this is zero impact. Is there anyone who says that I have this deal on the table that is going to reduce not CO2, but the temperature on a specific level, or that it's going to delay climate change, let's say by 50, 60 years? Kyoto, if properly implemented, on a tremendous cost, would delay climate change for years. As Björn Lomborg puts it, the guy who joined Bangladesh in 2100 will draw in 2104. And he will still be poor. That's not really a good deal. So instead of asking, quote, the deniers, why not ask these people, okay, your plan about halting economic progress and, I'm not saying stopping, I'm saying delaying, let's say, and of bringing these reductions, what exactly is the result? Again, I'm not denying anything. I give full credit to the scientists. I believe them in anything. But this is not a question to scientists. This is a question to policymakers. That's why I'm making this distinction. Science and policy making is something completely different.
Now I want to ask you a bit about a different critique of consumption, which is related to environmentalism, but maybe a different subset of it. And this is the idea that really took off in the 60s, which is we empower ourselves to improve the world that we live in by not consuming certain things. And perhaps the preeminent version of this kind of politics that you see on the left today is the veganism movement, which is about how we can make the world a better place, a more humane place, a place better for animals, a place that avoids the environmental problems that come with making meat if we just don't consume it. What do you think of this argument?
The way I see it is, I try to create a hierarchy of values here. The highest value is my life. And having tried various different things, I've tried taking my protein from soya, I've tried taking my protein from beans, not so much for the environment, more for, quote, selfish reasons, although I love animals. However, having done this, I have realized that the only diet that really promotes my well-being and my flourishing is a diet based on very clean eating, but which will include some clean proteins, like steak or salmon or eggs, mostly these three things. So I respect the choice of someone to say, I will do this. I don't respect, in terms of I don't endorse the philosophical position that I'm going to do this for the animals at the detriment of my own health or of my own well-being. If you can, and actually I'm usually annoyed on people who make fun of vegans. I don't make fun of them actually. And I used to buy soy protein, but it turns out my stomach is not very happy with it. So I returned, and it was cheap, so I wish it would work. But again, my point of reference is myself and my well-being. I cannot make this sacrifice for the animals. It's impossible to me. Maybe in the future, when these foods become better, I will. At the moment, I can't.
Would you agree that, for instance, if I don't have any adverse physical effects in becoming vegan, if my stomach can handle it, am I obligated to be a vegan then?
Definitely, you're not obligated. The only thing that you're obligated from is reality. For example, you're obligated, quote, from reality, not to drink 3 liters of whiskey every night because it's going to destroy your liver. Or not to smoke 2 packages of cigarettes. You don't have an unchosen moral duty or obligation for anything, except from not harming the rights of others. It's impossible for me to find a theoretical formula in which animals have rights, except if they're property of people. That's why I'd be very happy for more and more parts of nature to be privatized, because it's the best way to support, to sustain it, let's say. But I cannot see how it can be an obligation. Again, I love animals. The reason I haven't got cats or dogs is because I get so attached to them, my heart breaks when they die or when they get sick. But I cannot take this step. I 100% respect it in other people, but it's not a moral obligation. The only moral obligation you have is to yourself and to your life. And the only one imposing this obligation is reality.
So you don't think that you have obligations to animals where if you can live without eating them safely, you should try to do that independently whether you think meat tastes good?
If meat is the biggest enjoyment of your life or a big enjoyment of your life, don't give it up. I mean, otherwise, I'm telling you, go for something which is more suffering. Now, again, I don't know. It's very difficult to put it in concrete terms. I would say the philosophical principle is the one I mentioned, but then what happens in different people, it depends on them. It depends. So if you can afford eggs the chicken is free ranging and it has a great time. Yeah, if you can afford, buy it. If I become slightly richer, I'm gonna try and do it more. And also, it's good for you. Grass-fed meats is supposed to be better. I don't know because I can't afford it. But if I could, I would buy it. Why not? When it's good for me, the animals don't suffer. But again, why is it bad for the animals to suffer? Because I have values, and I value them as pets, as companions, whatever. And the image of something suffering is bad. This is where the value of animals not suffering comes from. It's impossible to say that the value is somewhere out there. I'm not a Platonist who says nature has rights or value outside of human experience. We are the ones creating value. If we get extinct, value goes with us, right? So that's the only frame in which you can say, I want to protect nature.
So you don't have a problem with lots of animals being slaughtered so that people can enjoy the taste of them when they don't need to enjoy the taste of them?
Yeah, I accept it as in terms that it creates a situation of human flourishing which is above the discomfort I get from the idea of the animals being slaughtered. And I would definitely want to find a way for the animals not to suffer. But to put it in a more extreme position, people who are, quote, carnivorous because, I don't know, it heals them or it deals with their problem, the things that Jordan Peterson says about himself and his daughter. Again, this is an extreme case which shows the hierarchy of values. Your life is the highest value. It's the standard of all other values. So you do whatever you want to protect it. If it means eat steak 5 times a day, you do that. That's the whole point of value. Without your life, there is no value.
And it seems that you're implicitly saying that your enjoyment has a lot of value. It's not just your health.
Yes, your enjoyment has a lot of value because your enjoyment means I am succeeding in my goals and I'm celebrating it. But also, I need it. if, let's say, next week I have a very important public speaking engagement, I'm going to eat more salmon this week and kale because it's the combination with some good carbs that keeps me very healthy. It's a priority for me.
So, interesting. You think, obviously, that it wouldn't be okay to slaughter children if adults enjoyed eating them, but it's okay to slaughter animals if adults enjoy eating them.
Yes, because it's the issue. I cannot see how you can say that animals have rights. I would love to find a rational way to prove that animals have rights, but probably not going to happen. Because the thing that give us rights, it's impossible to portray these things in animals. Now, hypothetical scenario. You are a super billionaire, trillionaire, and you buy all the cows in the country and you put them under your protection, and now meat becomes more expensive. You have the right to do that. That's how you can protect and save the animals, but you cannot do it by giving them rights. It makes no sense that an animal has rights.
Interesting. So on that note, let's talk about how the left's ideas of rights have changed in the very recent past, the last 10 years, and we'll finish with this topic. I don't know if you feel this way, but it seems like the left in the last 10 years, after the 2008 economic crisis, has actually made another shift in its thinking, a shift which has alienated a lot of people who grew up like myself on the left. So what do you think this shift since the crisis has been?
Well, you tell me, what do you mean? What would you recognize, for example, as these new rights?
Well, it seems like there are many more individual rights on the left which have to do with punishing people for not validating you. There are many more individual rights which have to do with punishing people for not accepting narratives of how you're aggrieved and how you need solidarity expressed to you by the public independently of what they agree with. And it seems like those rights are kind of at the front of the leftist queue, and the economic rights that have always been in the left are sort of in the middle or the back.
Yeah, that's true.
10 years ago, it seemed like the economic rights were more at the front. What do you think has caused that, or do you think that's what happened?
Well, first of all, it has to do with men in the left have a lot of their economic issues are not very high in their priority because they're middle class sometimes with secure and good jobs, but that's psychologizing. I will give a more kind of principled answer, which is that this assault on the idea of individual rights did not start with the left. Most of the bad things did not necessarily start with the left. For example, see the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. This is such an assault in the idea of what is an individual right that through decades of adding more and more and more things in the basket of quote rights, then we reach the point where the idea of individual rights makes no sense. And everyone can have a go. Everyone can throw whatever they want for them. For example, if decent housing is your individual right, careful in terms of your human right, not in terms that you are free to pursue it, but that it has to be provided to you. Then why not everything else? Why not the pronouns? Why not, I don't know, toilets, or I don't know what other cultural wars around rights are there today? If you have undermined the idea of rights, which is what the right and the left have done for decades, no one takes the idea of, or the definition of rights as a sanction to action any more seriously. So everyone has a go at it. And we just stare back, watch the sad spectacle, and hope that at some point we're not going to be in the center of it.
Do you think that the 2008 crisis is what explains this change, or do you think it's more of the rise of the internet and social media?
It's very interesting that you mentioned the crisis, because this brings me to one of the biggest parts of my book, which is the Occupy movement. Now, this movement supposedly started as a reaction to the crisis. And what do you see in that movement? You see literally almost zero claims that have to do specifically with the crisis. So their only official kind of claim was we need more transparency in the city of London. Like, seriously? That's the big idea? And everything else, so 1% of the movement was about actually dealing with the crisis. 99% was the kitchen soups, declarations about Palestine, vegan cuisines, meditation rooms. Again, I'm not saying this in a demeaning way, but it's very interesting that a movement that supposedly were the 99%, and we talk about the 99%, God knows why and who put them there to talk for us, which is also weird, because you cannot talk for people who are not there, but anyway. But also, you choose to talk about people that the vast majority of the 99% couldn't care less, like recycling and things like that. So this is a bit weird. So I don't think the 2008 crisis played such a role because no one took it seriously. In this country, in Greece, it played a different role, but in this country, we're in the UK, or even in the United States, it didn't teach much to the left. Actually, even worse, the people who were the villains then, Bush, for example, is now celebrated because he makes cute jokes with Michelle Obama in funerals of statesmen like McCain or his father. It's like, how cute is that? Why? Because now the simplistic narrative is we all hate Trump. Therefore, the people whose policies contributed to the 2008 crisis are now whitewashed and are now good people.
That's interesting. I mean, one of the reasons why in the last 10 years a lot of people on the left became disaffected with it is because they thought after the crash there's going to be this incredible amount of revolutionary activism to either overthrow capitalism or at least really, really restructure it. And instead what we see is, next to nothing of any, substantive impact until about 2014. And then the activism from the left, which seems to be having this real substantive impact, is feminism and the race movements and the transgender stuff, and all of that seems like, for many leftists, like it's just delusional. It's complaining about oppressions that aren't actually there. What do you think about that?
I'm trying to see where it started, but it's very difficult. But again, it's a continuation of, first of all, if we want to name this with an overall term, it's tribalism. Tribalism is by the way, it's my next writing project. Hopefully, book project is on tribalism. Mm-hmm. And tribalism means, again, the beginning of tribalism is a lack of faith on reason and a lack of faith on individual. Therefore, immediately you team up with people who are like you. And what is the most preconceptual level that someone is like you? Same color, same gender, or same assumed gender. If we say that gender is something that you can choose, I don't want to enter this discussion. So you buddy up with these people, and now this becomes your political identity. It's difficult to come together in terms of principles and coming up with a program, because who has time for that in the times that we live in? So we come up on these very basic preconceptual things, of course, in right and left. Mm-hmm. Because what else is, for example, white nationalism? What else is alt-right? It's this tribal thinking that the world out there is too difficult for me. I mean, they say it openly. Richard Spencer specifically says, I recognize that Asians have higher IQ. Whites cannot compete with them, so we need to be protected. We need a safe space for white people. Quote, safe space. That's how he called it. And of course, you have similar tendencies in the left. So this process of undermining reason, undermining individualism, undermining the idea that the world out there can make sense and can be controlled leads to these tendencies, leads to these issues where, again, for example, I want specifically to mention the Kavanaugh case, because it's the case where all these things come together. Mm-hmm. Faith as opposed to reason, again, in both sides. I believe him because he's a good man. I believe her because he's a woman. I don't believe him because he's a white Republican. I don't believe her because he's a liberal. You have faith as opposed to reason, tribalism as opposed to individualism, and belief as opposed to proof. You have these things together in both sides. So I would say the Kavanaugh case is the best moment to capture the atmosphere and the zeitgeist we live in.
That's interesting. Do you think that there is a causal connection between this identity politics stuff, which is just getting more and more extreme and bizarre in 2018, and the 2008 crash, or do you think it's just a coincidence that it happened after that?
No, it's a coincidence. It's a coincidence because you would expect, for example, that this would raise questions about central banking. You would expect that this would raise questions about quantitative easing. Mm-hmm. These things are nowhere. And again, let's not be harsh on the left. The same happens with the right. What was the equivalent of the Occupy movement on the right, the Tea Party movement, or the Ron Paul campaigns in 2008, 2012? What happened to these things? Anything that had political essence, like questioning the Feds or questioning the quantitative easing, got forgotten, and the only thing we got is we're gonna be edgy culture warriors. How is this related to the crisis? Maybe the crisis politicized people, but the questions that should have been raised with the crisis were never raised. Or they were raised but then forgotten because tribalism took over and emotionalism took over.
Do you think the emotionalism and tribalism and irrationality can be best explained by the rise of social media and the idea that people feel that if they scream loud on the internet, things happen quickly as opposed to, screaming with a placard in the real world?
Well, it might have played a role, but again, we'll never know. We cannot go to an alternative reality where the social media are not there. So I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I still believe that social media are a power of overall of good. They have benefited my life so much. And that's why I tend to support them even when they do things that are considered wrong. For example, when they're banning conservative figures, my first claim is they have the right to do this. Not because they're private property, but overall I think they've done more good rather than bad. Would I know you personally without social media? Probably, we would have met in one conference and then I'd see you again after 2 years. I wouldn't even remember who you are, and vice versa. We see each other, we influence each other's thought. And again, my biggest heroes, I've learned so much from them, and I've never seen them in real life. Or sometimes I do, and it's even cooler, and then we can keep in touch because of social media.
Okay, that's interesting. So I guess the last thing I want to ask you about then is there's been another big change in the left in the last 10 years, which seems very different to even the left that I grew up with in the late 90s and early 90s, which is globalism has suddenly been associated with progressivism and protecting minorities, and anti-globalism, which I used to think was the left, that's suddenly now associated with right-wing populism. How did that happen?
Well, in a way, Trump is the horrible revenge of history, is the wrong answer to everything that the left was asking for in the early 2000s. They were saying, big corporations have too much power. We've lost the power to control because of globalization. The mainstream media are brainwashing us. We need more kind of different people in politics, and we need to support our workers who are not protected from this race to the bottom. And it's also interesting to see how the good guys and the bad guys change. For example, George Soros, who is now the favorite enemy of the extreme right and of the populist right, in previous years used to be the favorite enemy of the left because he was supposed this quote neoliberal who was promoting globalization. So again, what you see is there are these slogans that are floating, and they are in different times they're taken over by the right or by the left, coming from a starting point of again irrationalism, anti-capitalism, because some of the most fierce anti-capitalists are on the right, not necessarily on the left. Maybe the one good thing that Trump brought about is that left hopefully again appreciated things like globalization, free trade, and because again now the bad thing is called globalism. Globalism is a bit like neoliberalism, by the way. No one cares to define what it is.
Yeah, it's like Malays or something. It has different reference depending on who the speaker is. Do you think that the left should be more open to Trump? Because there are some commonalities there between Trump.
There are definitely commonalities between Trump and the left, which shows why both are horrible, in my opinion.
Okay.
For example, you see how he's against free trade. He has the urge of the central planner that the economy needs to be directed from somewhere. He has the urge that businesses need to be controlled. I see leftist pundits, what's her name? Candace Owens. He's kind of this new rising star of American conservatism. She has written a tweet last week, which I screenshotted it and I've saved it because I'm like, this is a turning point. Now officially the biggest anti-capitalists in the United States, or big anti-capitalists in the United States, are on the right. She says Google is a monopoly. It's time for the government to intervene and break it down. And this comes from the right. So I would say they're both terrible. The Trumpian right and the left, they're both terrible. Nothing is to be gained by any of these sides, and they need to be thrown to the dustbin, to the bin of history. Because the fact that they share these opinions show that they're both wrong.
Interesting. So, what are your thoughts on the UK's recent decision to Brexit in 2016?
I'm going to say something which is going to annoy a lot of common friends that we have. I support Brexit not as a declaration of democracy. I don't respect Brexit because it's a democratic vote. I respect it up to the point where it's going to lead to more freedom and less infringement of my rights and of our rights. For example, if you told me, and that's why I said in another panel that I don't want the second and a third and a fourth referendum, but if the result was wrong, or if the result is this horrible deal that May suggests, I wouldn't say I don't want another referendum because the majority has spoken and it's over. So I would not support Brexit coming from the democracy narrative. I would support Brexit only insofar as it leads to a situation where we don't have the bad things of the European Union, which is this closed community that excludes or makes different, for example, the life of producers in Asia or Africa or the United States. So I want a more open United Kingdom. Lower taxes, more open to immigration, of course with specific rules and controls, because you cannot be in favor of immigration and not being in favor of control, because then again you're undermining your own thesis. These things are not mutually exclusive. More open to the world, more liberal, but I am not one of the people who will say because we voted Brexit, then whatever comes that looks like Brexit is good. No. Again, we don't owe anything to anyone. If someone wants Brexit because he wants to, kick us out of our jobs or throw us back confiscate our property, that's a ridiculous example, just making this up. Then we cannot say, oh no, I respect the result of the referendum because the people have spoken. So this is how I view Brexit. There was an excellent article, it was probably the best thing I've read on Brexit in the last 2 years, by Christopher Snowdon, who's a guy in the Institute of Economic Affairs. He usually writes about lifestyle politics against the nanny state and things like that. He wrote an article last Sunday, or 1st or 2nd of December, who basically said, we lost. This guy is a liberal Brexiteer and basically says, we lost. That's it. We are between May's horrible deal and no deal, which is not going to be good because it's not going to be promoted by people who share our values, and something like a Remain. So basically he said, those of us who believed in Brexit based on these liberal, open society principles, we lost. And unfortunately, I think that's it. We lost.
Do you think that there was a kind of class warfare over Brexit in this country where the middle classes were kind of trying to protect the population from the lower orders, who they kind of associated with voting Leave and being Middle Englanders and being racist and so on?
Yes, of course. The tensions were very high and it was very, very nasty. But again, the question is, coming from what position? I'm a bit afraid that they came from a position of EU give us these specific benefits or privileges or rights. Some of these are rights. And therefore, these things cannot exist without the European Union, which is something very weird because no one gives you rights. You have rights and then someone recognizes them. If it's not the case, then it's privileges, it's not rights. For example, what happens with the university? I cannot accept that the EU is good because it's throwing money at the universities. This money comes from somewhere. If what we're doing is good, this money will come to us anyway. So I cannot accept these people's concerns on issues such as, for example, what will happen to our funding. I'm very happy to support their concerns on issues of immigration. That's why I'm saying I'm very unprincipled, quote, on the Brexit discussion, because I have very strict principles. And whoever goes against these principles, I'm very happy to throw them politically under the bus. So if I see, for example, that Brexit is going towards a country where, I don't know, there's no immigration and there's a controlled Corbyn-style economy, I'm very, very happy to say now you are public danger in political terms number one.
So I suppose we should end this by saying you've written this incredible book about the history of the left and where it's changed and where it's been. Is there anything that the left could do in the future to induce you to go back to it?
Yeah, this is literally the last page of my book, which is also the reason why one person that I really love and I really respect kindly asked me not to endorse the book. So I asked him to write, something kind on the last page. And he said, after I read your last page, I don't know what to write. And I said, look, I totally understand it. No hard feelings. Please don't write anything because I'll put you in a difficult position. This guy's a leftist. Mm-hmm. He's an esteemed professor. He wasn't afraid. It just is going to be weird. So what I write on the last page is that the only way for the left to be relevant is to understand that the number one cardinal values is freedom and the individual. And individuals being free to use their minds and live their lives. That's why I give examples such as Uber, 3D printing, and other things that the left is very skeptical of at the moment. But the left, as we know, this would mean a negation of itself.
So is this another way of saying you'd join the left if the left became libertarian?
No. The reason I joined the left was 100% my misreading of the left. It's not that the left changed. Of course, the left has changed, but it was more an idea I had of the left. Because look, you're born in Greece, right? Greece has a history of I don't know how many military dictatorships of the right, of royalists, or of quasi-fascists before the war. Then a civil war where my extended family who were leftists had to flee to travel abroad. Or that if you were a leftist, you couldn't find a job. Or there was all this control by the church and the state. By the state, I mean the right-wing state. So then you grow up and you ask yourself, am I one of these guys? Am I like a religious, conservative, royalist? Say no, I'm for tolerance, free speech, science. So the default position is, therefore I'm in the left. Like these are the good guys. And it took me more than a decade to question these premises. And yeah, I wouldn't say the left has changed. I just misread the left. I had the same premises in mind, some of the same values in my mind. That's why I told you I enjoyed like these heroic proletarians who in the propaganda films would wake up at 5 in the morning, to do the best they could with their life. But I soon realized that these ideas are not anywhere to be found in the left. And of course, not to be found even in the right, as the right is today.
Okay, so on the whole then, you think maybe your affiliation with the left came from a misreading of it, just seeing it as the negation of something you didn't like rather than looking at the substance of what it was.
Yeah, but I don't want to make it sound as an excuse, because there's no excuse. It was 100% my responsibility and taking the easy way and do what basically everyone else was doing. And not question these things that were delivered to me as self-evident. So, but also this had made me way less critical about other people. And I specifically see this with my students. Someone is 20 years old and they show up in class and they have in the laptop, fuck capitalism, down with patriarchy, and, you're all fascists, whatever. I'm way more sympathetic and tolerant to that person because I was that person. I was way worse than that person. I was way more philosophically radical. Not in real life, because I didn't have the guts to do what I was actually advocating, which is something I'm really embarrassed of myself, that I advocated for these things. But there is no excuse. But the good lesson is that people can change.